Tom was serving in South Pacific when he was killed, and it took a while. Yes, that letter was returned to my mother, stamped deceased, and I found it in all the letters completely unopened. It was a very hard thing for me to decide whether to open it or not. But in the meantime, there was much ado at home. My mother was terribly depressed. She didn't write to my father at all for a long time, but he never stopped writing. He wrote almost every day. There was a letter from him not only to my mother but to his mother. So my grandmother kept his letters and my mother kept his letters. So while he was in Africa, he wasn't aware that Tom had been killed. So he kept writing, wondering why my mom wasn't writing back. But his letters were, they weren't allowed to talk about the war in their letters. They were censored. A lot of his, they have a little slice out of it, like the words have been razored out. But I think my dad was pretty careful about what he said, so there weren't a lot of censors. But he wrote a lot about where he was and what the conditions were like, which I found fascinating. So here's a little excerpt from one of his letters. He describes a lot of the conditions in Africa, which were, third world. They lived in tents. They endured horrible dust storms and scorpions in their sleeping bags or whatever they slept in. I'm not sure about that. Flies, heat and cold, of course. It's Africa. It's boiling during the day and freezing at night. But he still had a lot of admiration for Africa. And, in spite of all these discomforts, the beauty of his surroundings did not escape my father. And here's a quote from one of his letters. "I guess anyone who has such a love of beauty as I have is a misfit in the army. I have always claimed that there was no other place where sunsets were so beautiful or as brilliant and full of color as at Blue Mountain Lake. And I feel almost a traitor when I admit that in Africa, both sunsets and sunrises here are more beautiful than anywhere else I've ever been. And not only occasionally, but almost every day, there is almost certain to be a wonderful, breathtaking display of color. We seem to be almost surrounded by steep, multicolored hills and mountains, which are beautiful in the late evening light. I can't make out whether there's vegetation on them or not, but they are covered with gullies and ridges which are all shades of purples, yellows and browns as they fall in light or shadow. In the distance are scattered Arab farms and villages.